different kind of fire. For a new era of worldly frustration, we offer a fresh conversation. I'm Greg Carlwood, and these are the Higher Side Chats.
Hello again, Higher Side Chatters. How the hell are you? Drinking a little drink, smoking a little smoke, just really letting the weight of today's show sink in. I mean, it's not that I didn't know the work of Freemasons and many ancient monuments contained complex architecture, and it's not that I didn't know man used to get great insights from mapping the night sky. And there's several other things we discussed that aren't exactly new ideas to me, but it's the way they connect with so many main THC topics that really got me pumped up. Psychedelic exploration, magic, symbolism, secret societies, the eradication of ancient knowledge, it's all there. And I won't waste any more time prefacing. You know I like to get to the point around here. I had hoped to get a message from the Money Bomb winner on this show, but I didn't want to make you wait any longer, so maybe next week. But a listener named Andrew got $274, which is half of this month's donations. Hopefully that relieves a little of Andrew's stress or contributes to the beating back of one of the Squid of Power's oily tentacles in his world. Also to play us in this week, I got a new piece of transition music sent to me by a band called the Plate Scrapers. I really like it, and I love when bands are cool enough to put together a little 1-minute ditty about THC that I can use for these purposes. So big thanks to the Plate Scrapers. I hope you like it. But with that said, I gotta get this show on the road, so pack your glass and park your ass, people, because this is deep stuff, and I think you'll all come out on the other side with some aha moments well worth your time. So let's do the damn thing. Interference theory, musical perception, harmonic sciences, sacred geometry, psychonautics, archaeoacoustics, the Venus blueprint, and the kitchen sink with Richard Merrick. Enjoy!
Pack it and park it, tune in and spark it, 'cause Greg's about to open up your mind. Armed with information about the secret manipulation and the wisest aficionados he can find. And he's pulling back the curtain on what we thought we knew for certain, so we can see the world with a brand new set of eyes. You're listening to the Higher Side.
All right, people, if there's one thing we know, it's that we don't know much. A lot of our history has been lost or suppressed, with endless sagas of people conquered, their culture and knowledge buried, forced at the end of a gun to adopt customs of the new authority, on top of layers of manipulation and culture-shaping propaganda narratives. It's really hard to get a clear idea of the past without some serious research. Lucky for us, today's guest Richard Merrick has done one hell of a job uncovering some major areas of mystery by connecting things like suppressed sciences, sacred geometry, Masonic symbolism, musical perception, psychedelics, and several other major threads to weave together a clearer picture of the past and a better understanding of things they'd rather we didn't know. He's laid out most of his discoveries in his brilliant books, Interference, available for free on his website, and the follow-up, The Venus Blueprint. It's exciting stuff and has definitely affected the way I see the past forever, and I think it might just have the same effect on you guys. So let's do the damn thing. Richard, my man, welcome to THC.
Hey, Greg. Very glad to be with you today.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. I was made aware of your work via a guest request. I'm so glad, because I think you really make a compelling case for answering some of the mysteries of the past and the nature of reality, a section of science we don't hear about much. And through this study of musical perception, this geometric approach to music that you call harmonic interference theory, it's a super interesting explanation. I guess this is where we should start, because it can be pretty dense, but let's walk the people through this work of yours. Tell us about harmonic interference theory and this path that led up to it. What were some of the initial curiosities that fueled this fire for you?
So about 35 years ago or so, I was a young musician and learning music theory and taking classes in university on different approaches to music theory. And in the process, I began to question much of what I was taught. It just didn't hang together well. It was all based on tradition. As I came to find out, it was based on the Roman Catholic Church tradition of sacred music. And there was, a lot of smart people that were hypothesizing different reasons for why music sounded good to us, and why we enjoyed it, and why it triggered emotions and things like that. But none of that really seemed to connect with the historical development of music over thousands of years, and what I was learning in contemporary jazz at the time as well. So I had a professor in university that was giving a course on pre-Baroque counterpoint. It's also called Renaissance counterpoint. So that's the music, or the way music was written in the church for sacred music prior to Johann Sebastian Bach, for instance, before the Baroque period.
Mm-hmm.
And there were all these rules, and so I asked the professor, why so many rules? How did they come up with these rules? What were the purpose of the rules? Things like that. Why were rules like this required to create sacred music? And he avoided the question, and I asked it again in class, and finally he said, well, if you'll stay after class, I'll be happy to answer your question. And so I stayed behind. There was a couple other people that were curious as well. And I said, so what is it? Why so many rules? And he said, well, it's all based on one idea. And that is what the church called Diabolus in Musica, or the devil in music. And he said, this is the tritone, which is the interval that is 1/2 of an octave. And he said that the church fathers felt that this was evil, an evil interval, and it was literally the devil incarnate in music, and that in order to play music in the church, you had to eliminate the tritone, the devil. And so all these rules were about avoiding the devil in music, and that was what we were learning. And he says, you can trace them all back to that. So, well, that is really interesting. And I thought it was really fascinating, given that I was being taught the tritone as being a central part of jazz in my jazz music. I thought, well, isn't that interesting that for 1,500 years, certainly at least 1,200 years, the tritone had been the scourge of music. It was the thing to be taken out of the sacred music of the Catholic Church, and here we were in modern times, and we were being taught that it's the central component of music. It's in modern music theory, it's called the tritone function, and it's considered a central functioning element in music, modern music. And so I wondered immediately, started asking questions. Why, what changed? How did it go from being despised to being loved? Where did that occur in history? Mm-hmm. And then the second question was, what does that have to do with our perception of music? Why is it that it sounds good to us now, but to them it didn't?
Right.
And so those questions led to a series of threads of inquiry that have led to development of harmonic interference theory, which has as a central element the tritone function. And all of that led to deeper and deeper discoveries of how harmonic theory was the center point of the development of religion. Music was always a central element, one of the central elements in religion, and it was really a cornerstone of Catholic ritual and sanctification, and in a sense, through music, trying to expel the devil from people's psyche. And so it's interesting that a musical interval would have such a core role in the Catholic Church. And so anyway, that's where it all began for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. And then, of course, this led you down a path that's way more into the scientific realm, kind of the science of music and music perception. And it's just something that I guess I always took for granted. But it does come up with a lot of guests that there might have been some old sound technology that the ancients used for, one speculative purpose or another. But it seems like when the Roman Catholic Church comes up and gets involved, they changed a lot of things. And hiding this might have been one of them, I guess, right?
It was. It was, if you played or you sang a tritone interval, you could be punished. And, I thought when I wrote the first book, Interference, I thought that maybe when I was starting to write it and going into it, the first thing I wanted to know is, how did the rules get started? How did the anti-tritone rules get started? Mm-hmm. And when were they overthrown, or when did they fall out of favor? And my hunch was that Bach had something to do with it, and indeed he did. The Baroque music corresponds to the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was in Germany where the Reformation got started with Martin Luther, and that's when they disconnected from the papal rule or from the Pope and began to develop their own version of Christianity away from the Roman Church. And it was at that point that Bach and his family really were developing Baroque music, which Baroque actually means broke. It means irregular pearl or something that is incorrect. Mm-hmm. And so from the church point of view, Baroque music was broken, literally. And the reason it was broken was because Bach started introducing in greater and greater numbers tritones into his music, into his sacred music that was played in the Protestant churches of Germany and spread westward, across Europe. So it's interesting that that's where the tritone was sort of set free and became created the foundation for Western music after that. But it also pushed me back further to say, well, did the Roman Church invent this idea that the tritone was evil, or did it precede the church in some way? And of course, it did precede the church. Before Christianity, the Romans had conquered Greece, and people who have studied ancient Greece, they will know that music played a big part of the philosophy behind the Greek, civilization, and it was a major part of law. I mean, they legislated what kind of scales, how many strings a lute could have, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And the person who is credited with creating the foundation of those laws was Pythagoras, because Pythagoras is the one who discovered a lot of things about music. The idea that you had this cycle of fifths. He's the one who created, or at least was part of the development of these the Greek scales or modes. Mm-hmm. And the development of those from something called tetrachords, either conjunctive or disjunctive tetrachords. And anyway, there's a whole story there that I'll talk about towards the beginning of Interference as to how our scales that we have today began. And at the center of that development between what was called conjunctive tetrachords and disjunctive was the tritone. And he is credited with discovering that the tritone is incommensurable, or they could not create a tritone or a middle. They couldn't split the octave in the middle where the tritone is using simple harmonic proportions like other intervals in scales. Mm-hmm. And so the Pythagoreans and the Greeks in general, Plato later, they all felt that there was an error in the universe as a result, that this error was located at the tritone. That was like a crack in, the cosmic void, and that it was evil. And to the Pythagoreans, you couldn't even mention this, they called it the schisma, or, the split.
Wow. And
they couldn't reconcile it with their philosophy, and so it was against the rules to mention it. It was heresy to mention it. And so, to me, that's kind of, okay, maybe that's where it started. It turns out that there's probably, that he probably learned about that from much older sources. I mean, there's some evidence going back even 1,400 years before Pythagoras, to where they were beginning to recognize this or discover it in the tracing planets and their rhythms and so forth. It's not just a Catholic Church issue, it goes back into ancient history and ancient philosophy, and is in many ways the foundation of the idea that there is evil, that there's a dualism in the universe between good and evil.
Right.
And this sort of broke the harmony of the world. Now, all that started raising questions for me that said, okay, if this is true, how does that play into human perception? Mm-hmm. Because the Catholic Church would say, oh, that interval is inside your head. It's inside everything. Mm-hmm. And so it's inside your mind, your psyche, and your body. And the same kind of questions, come up in various scientific disciplines as well, where there's, something called free space or various kinds of, I don't know. There's a whole subject there to go down. I don't want to get bogged down in it, but
sure.
But there is this idea that not everything is harmonic. Not everything is can be described by simple harmonic proportions, and that's where things like the golden ratio and Fibonacci series spirals come into play. Mm-hmm. Because when you think about harmonics, you're really thinking about resonant points where simple ratios interfere to create, a resonant pattern. Mm-hmm. And the opposite of that is where there's what's called damping, where resonance is minimized or it's killed.
Right.
And so you can find hints of this idea of harmonic resonance and damping as being opposites in mythology, especially Greek mythology. They were aware that, there was silence in between the sound.
Interesting.
And so there's a lot of philosophical things like that. But that really is the foundation of harmonic interference theory, because what I ended up, I had to deprogram myself along the way, honestly. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That was a big part of trying to break through some of these hard problems, is to not assume anything. Any place where you might have an assumption, you need to step back and ask, why do you assume that?
Right.
And I had this sort of breakthrough that Western science seems to, and this includes the study of music, perception, that Western science is all focused on the foreground energy patterns. They don't pay any attention to the silent gaps in between the sound. They don't realize that there's a field of silence that all of this patterning is playing out on, and that there's a foreground and background to be considered, not just a foreground.
Right.
Which was kind of stunning, and I found that wave theory, as it's taught in the universities, which would use Fourier analysis and all the methods associated with that, as being nothing but a way to look at the foreground energy patterns. And there was no interest in the patterns, the gaps, and the patterns behind that were also perfectly recognizable if you just think about your eardrum or the inside of your, the basilar membrane inside your ear that recognizes things. There's no reason why the gaps between the energy wouldn't be just as recognizable as the energy itself.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's what kind of opened up a view for me of how to explain the entire history of music, harmony and melody and perception, with the way the ear is organized and the brain is organized. And I came up with an equation that I call the interference function, that is a simplified way of expressing what science calls the Gaussian derivative distribution. And hardly anybody pays any attention to that particular thing, but I'm looking out my window right now. I'm up in the mountains in Colorado, and I'm looking out my window, and I see mountains that are shaped just like this Gaussian distribution, which I ended up finding to be the distribution of resonance across an octave in music. So there is this idea that when things resonate, they create a standing wave, or a wave that's vibrating and resonating, and within that resonating wave forms harmonic waves, or what are called wave partials. And those partials are whole numbers. They're twice the frequency of the primary wave, or they're 3 times or 4 times or 5 times. And the big question to ask is, how does it know to do that? How do harmonics know how to form? Well, do they make decisions? Well, of course not. They don't make decisions. There is a physics at work underneath all of this. Anything that's vibrating, reflecting and vibrating like a guitar string, there's some physics at work that force these sympathetic waves to form. And science has not done a good job of answering that. If you were to look that up right now, Google it, you'd find a lot of information about harmonics, but you wouldn't find much about, if anything, about how harmonics form. Why do they form that way? Why aren't there multiple waves, multiple of 1.5 or 2.3 or 4.2?
Mm-hmm.
No, they're all even multiples. And so the question, the fundamental question to answer in order to begin understanding how music is perceived, and this really means how anything is perceived, is to explain the process by which harmonics form.
Mm-hmm.
Big question, huge question, really, because it's at the core of everything you see.
Yeah.
Everything, all atoms are little standing waves. They're all resonating.
Right.
And all matter is made up of these little resonant atoms, resonating with each other in different ways and creating patterns, crystallizing into minerals and liquid crystals of biological, and plant life and so forth.
Right.
And so the fundamental question, if you can answer why harmonics form in a resonant cavity, then you're at the core question. You're beginning to understand the physics of space and time and that sort of thing. And so it becomes quickly not just a question of musical tradition or musical perception, it becomes a question of how reality exists at all.
Right. Consciousness and matter and, basically everything.
Everything. And it all comes down to how do harmonics form, because that's how structure forms.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I found a spectral analysis, it's called a Blackman spectral analysis, that a musicologist up in Indiana had put together, and I found his research, and he had done an analysis of two musical tones separating, in a smooth pattern, a smooth sweep, from a unison to an octave. So imagine one tone being held on, let's say, a C, and then another tone starting on that same C, but then steadily increasing or sweeping up to the octave above that C.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very super simple. But when you do an analysis of that, visual analysis of it, you find that there's little patterns, that a pattern forms over that octave, and that there are points along that pattern where you hit these simple harmonic proportions, these simple harmonic ratios, and a little gap or a pattern forms, a little vertical gap in the analysis. And when you look at the distribution of those gaps, those harmonic gaps, it forms this Gaussian derivative that I mentioned.
Interesting.
Yeah. And so it's a natural pattern. It's what happens when you are able to see all of the harmonics interfere with one another over an octave. I'd never seen anything like that because music theory had been separated from science hundreds of years ago, basically during the Enlightenment, which I tend to call the Endarkenment.
Yeah.
Because we gained some things, but we lost some pretty fundamental things too. And it's, the move towards scientific rationalism was deeply involved with an avoidance of offending the church. Otherwise you might get tortured and imprisoned,
Right.
like Galileo.
And I'm wondering sometimes if this reluctance to offend the church, or the church labeling something like the tritone as the devil in music,
yes.
I wonder at the top, are they really that superstitious, or are they just trying to hide breadcrumbs to understanding our reality and how consciousness works? Because we say this dovetails into so many different areas, and
it does.
We've talked often about a section of science that seems to be quarantined, a section of physics that seems to be involving not only electrogravity, but also resonance and music. And I guess that's my question for you. When you look back and you see that they once were a lot more clued in to these kind of things than we are today, do you think it's an accident that we stumbled into ignorance, or was this a calculated play to kind of change the way people think?
Well, the Roman Church, again, it goes back to them trying to create sacred music and to to create a catharsis or a purity. And that goes back to long before the Catholic Church, where the idea is that you're trying to create nothing but good, that you're trying to purify the world and purify people's minds and help them attain, a higher mode of thought. It seems like the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. It seems like the good thing to do, because you're getting rid of evil thoughts. Think about the Dark Ages. You just had nothing but marauders killing everybody and ravaging your villages and your civilization, and it just happened over and over again. So it's understandable that there would be a desire and the emergence of a power like the Roman Church that came out of the Roman Empire, which fell, and they were basically, instead of using brute force, they were using mind control and trying to change people's beliefs about what was acceptable behavior, and connecting their behavior then to entrance into the kingdom of heaven or whatever. So it's understandable why and how that would occur. It was extenuating circumstances, and music was a key component of that because it was the philosophical embodiment of physics to try to create a pure, sacred space. The problem comes, though, that when you realize that what they were doing was creating something that was unnatural. It's not natural to have only one half of the equation.
Yeah.
The truth of the matter is that the tritone, with all the fear and loathing that was connected with it, is a part of nature, and it is a critical part of nature. And it's not, without it, as I came to find out, you wouldn't have the kind of order and containment of resonance that you need to keep things from just exploding apart, and that's philosophically represented in music, the way the tritone actually functions. It's essentially the juxtaposition of a circle, which is periodic, that's where order comes from, and the spiral, which is this infinite curve into, either the macro or the micro. Mm-hmm. And so it's a balance between the circle and the spiral. And that was said, the Greek philosopher Philolaus would say that, would say that it's the finite and the infinite were represented by the circle and spiral. And what I found in this Gaussian distribution was that when you balance the harmonic series against the Fibonacci series, you get the curve, this distribution that is this a Gaussian derivative curve that is essentially like a mountain, not an equal mountain, but a mountain that has a hump on one side and then gradually attenuates down into infinity. And so there is something very natural about the fact that both are involved in the construction of nature. One wants to explode, the other one wants to damp or contain. And the balance between those is where we are.
Yeah.
But now going back to the question about what happened, in effect, how did all of this get sort of suppressed? It wasn't just the church that suppressed it, at least relative to our current modern day. It was what I call a complicity of convenience between the early scientists and the church. Because, as everybody knows, Galileo was denounced and imprisoned and basically cast out and diminished by the church for his belief that the sun, the heliocentric theory, that the sun was at the center of our solar system,
right, rather
than the Earth, and there was a bunch of other things. All of that was viewed by the Roman Church as heresy, but very specific, more like pagan religion, because paganism, which would be anything other than Christianity in the church's view, was largely founded on natural observation of nature. It was based on musical concepts. It was based upon astrological concepts. And the Roman Church was trying to separate itself from the astrotheologies that had preceded it. And central to that, from a scientific point of view, was harmonic theory, which science was primarily focused on. I mean, if you think about it, music and musical vibration, as well as planetary patterns, are the most accessible aspects of physics. I mean, you can observe those, and so those were things that the church was suppressing, and yet the scientists, Kepler and Galileo, and even Carl Gauss, where the Gaussian distribution is named after, all of these guys were trying to avoid. Well, they were Christians to begin with, because everybody, around it was required.
Yeah.
So they were trying to maintain their own personal lives and their own personal reputation and make a living and so forth, like any scientist today is. And at the same time, they're trying to answer these burning questions that they had about reality, about the world around them, and harmonic concepts were a big part of that. And so there was this complicity between those early natural philosophers, alchemists, scientists, whatever you want to call them, and the Roman Church. They believed in God. They believed in Jesus as the personal Savior. At least they would say that in public. But at the same time, they were trying to be truthful to themselves. And so there were certain things they wouldn't talk about, and what they learned to avoid were things that were explicitly related to harmonic theory, because, again, the Roman Church built their whole idea of sacred space and Catholic purity around this idea that they're not going to reveal what the tritone is, or how it plays in music theory, perception,
right,
structure of life, and things like that. So that's why science has avoided it, and the way it avoided it was very pragmatic. It was, let's just divide up areas of study so that people can specialize in these different areas, and we won't integrate it into a big picture, which is what harmonic theory does.
Right.
It integrates, whereas science, based on the root sciene, or like a scythe, it cuts, it divides.
Damn.
And that's what science is it's an avoidance strategy to avoid offending the church.
Damn. I love that. So I do want to fast forward a little bit to the Venus blueprint section, because that's amazing stuff. But first, let me ask you how this kind of jives with string theory or the holographic universe theory, because that seems to be an idea, that vibration brings matter into existence. It seems to be kind of on the forefront of fringe scientific understanding, or at the very least, it seems pretty related.
Yes, it is completely related. It's all the same thing. I mean, this last point I just made, quantum mechanics, which really emerged, in the 1920s and 30s, in terms of its, developing many of the core principles, it's all based upon this idea of standing waves and, they have this resonator model of reflected waves within a box, and that everything really in harmonic or in quantum theory is based on this resonance model. So all that is a encodification and a rather obtuse set of equations and approaches that are all really this ancient harmonic theory, just sort of couched in a new language that, again, religious people, the church, wouldn't really understand. And I would say that from the alchemists, through the development of science, that these languages, these formal languages that became very popular and now is, standard in every field of science, came out of this avoidance strategy.
Yeah.
That if you could come up with your own language and speak it, then if somebody in the church happened to get their hands on your paper, they would look at that and wouldn't have a clue what you're saying.
Right.
And of course, you could befuddle them, if they ever really got you in a corner and say, oh, no, it's saying this or that. You could completely defend yourself. And so that's really where a lot of this came from. I mean, the early scientific papers that were being distributed through Europe were being distributed through the Masonic Brotherhood.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my next questions. Is this where we see kind of secret societies taking, things like sacred geometry or sacred knowledge? Is this the kind of information that we see them kind of trying to keep alive covertly under the radar?
Yes, and that's where these, mathematics and other formulaic languages and formalisms, really were a help, so that the people who had the knowledge, who were trained in the art, let's say, would be able to understand, what these papers were. But if they fell into the wrong hands, it really couldn't be used to. The Inquisition, couldn't be called in because they wouldn't really know what's going on. They wouldn't understand it.
Yeah. I love that element to it. I love the secrecy of it. So if we can, let's talk about the Venus blueprint. I mean, this is where I guess your study of interference theory, you started to recognize this in architecture. And I think this is kind of where it started at the Rosslyn Chapel, right?
Yeah, well, that actually, the Rosslyn Chapel thing, I was in the middle of writing the first book, Interference, and, it's kind of blowing my mind as I'm, you can imagine, I'm hitting these little walls of what's going on here and then breaking through them and realizing that there was information that was definitely had been suppressed, again, through this either complicity or explicit. And so then suddenly I see this this press release that came out of Scotland, out of Edinburgh, Scotland, about this father-son team, Thomas and Stuart Mitchell, who had decoded these patterns that were carved into the arches of Rosslyn Chapel. Nobody had any idea of what those little patterns were or what they meant, but they were little cubes, literally cubic stone things that had pattern on them that were like little arms that were holding them out from the arches. It's just go online and Google Rosslyn Chapel cubes and you'll see what I mean. And
sorry, when was the Rosslyn Chapel built? So we have understanding.
Yes, it was built in the 15th century. It started around the middle, I believe it was 1446 or 1450 when it was started, and it was completed a couple of decades later.
Okay.
And it was built by the it was built on the land that was owned by the Sinclair family. Or St. Clair, but they're what we would call Sinclair. And if you're familiar with the Sinclair oil, the old Sinclair gas stations,
right,
that was related to that family up there. And the chapel itself was designed, however, by a man by the name of Sir Gilbert Hay, and his last name is interesting in that you find out that it's an Armenian name. It's Haik was an Armenian king, and so there's this noble bloodline thing that you start getting into, and you find that the Sinclairs and the Hays were related if you go far enough back, and that they're related to the royal families in Europe, and that Sir Gilbert Hay was he had been the Chamberlain, which is kind of like a secretary to this man by the name of Rene d'Anjou, who was the titular king of Jerusalem. he was in title, he was the king of Jerusalem, but he was, like I forget all of his titles, but like the king of Aragon. I mean, it reads like some kind of a mythical medieval story, but he really was tied to all these different bloodlines and had all these noble things. The problem is he didn't have any real power. He did have money, and so Gilbert Hay, who actually fought alongside Joan of Arc, by the way, was actually a poet. And that was his big thing. But back then, poets were a lot more than poets are today. Poets were sort of the keeper of. I mean, they were writers, but they were considered sort of the ultimate artists, and philosophers. And so Gilbert Hay went to be a a tutor to the Sinclair children in Edinburgh, or outside of Edinburgh, where Rosslyn is, and the Rosslyn Castle was, and so forth at the time. And between the two of them, Sinclair and Hay, they decided to build this Rosslyn Chapel as a collegiate chapel to St. Matthew. However, all of that is very, basically just to avoid the ire of the church, because when you look at the actual symbolisms and what are built into the chapel, you realize that it's teaching you more than just about Christianity. It's really teaching you the entire history and origin of religion in general.
Yeah, man, I think this is just so fascinating. I did kind of get you off track, but we were talking about the, I guess the thing that unlocked it for you was looking at these inscriptions on the archways.
Yes, those patterns. So the Mitchells had decoded those as cymatic patterns, what's called cymatics. They're also called Chladni patterns, and these are patterns that form when you have a plate or a container of liquid, either one, and actually it works with gas and plasma and other things. It doesn't matter the medium as much as it matters that there's a container of some sort. And within it is a medium that, when it's vibrated, it will create certain patterns at different frequencies. So if you're dealing with square patterns, which is what the cubes in Rosslyn Chapel exhibit, you would create, for instance, get a square piece of metal, balance it in the center of that on a little thin pole or something, and then sprinkle dust or powder or sand onto the plate, and then vibrate the edge of the plate with, let's say, a bow, a violin bow.
Gotcha.
And that, when you do that, and depending on the frequencies that you get, it will create different patterns. That's because different harmonic combinations in a vibrating medium like that will create different geometries. This is where sacred geometry originated, is from sound patterns. Okay, and from just explorations of circles and squares and triangles and things like that, which again can be produced by sonic patterns.
So this is clearly how you could encode music in a geometric form, because it always, whatever tone you play, always makes the same pattern, right?
Well, it does, as long as you're in the same container. Okay, same
environment.
Yes, exactly, because this is the thing a lot of people don't really realize or even admit when they're talking about it, and that is that if you had larger, smaller containers that had deeper or more shallow water in it, or had a different, like glycerin or mercury, different viscosities of liquid, all of those things affect, and the shape of the container, all those things affect the kind of patterns that will form. Mm-hmm. But once you have a particular container, let's say like a cube or a square of that size, then each frequency will, different frequencies will form specific patterns, and it can be repeated forever. Well, these cubes each had a different pattern, and as they played out through the arches, there was a melody that the Mitchells found by comparing them to these cymatic, patterns. Mm-hmm. And then they got the melody, and they wrote a piece of music that they called the Rosslyn Motet that had that pattern. And they would perform it in Rosslyn Chapel, and still do occasionally. I was there during one performance, and it was pretty amazing. Mm-hmm. But at any rate, when I saw that press release, I immediately realized that, okay, there's something going on here, a connection between the physics of sound and the history of religion,
Yeah.
And, right. Is it like, oh, wow, this is great. So I got in contact with Stuart, and we began to correspond. And he would share things that he had found, and I would share things that I'd found. And so we kind of collaborated that way. And it was through that collaboration that I began to write the Venus Blueprint. And part of that was going and visiting him and some other people in Edinburgh, and made a pilgrimage to Rosslyn to see all this for myself. And I write about all that in the Venus Blueprint. And so that's kind of the difference between that book and probably other books on ancient civilizations or even medieval, is that it's not just a book about, this, I'm teaching you this, I'm telling you this. It was more of my, a real-time writing of my discoveries as I went, and my reasoning and my logic. And so people who read that can participate in the discovery that I was at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a much more fun approach, to do that. But it's also, for me, writing my thoughts down, much like a diary, as we went, it's easier to trace and bring myself along, even when I read it again, or somebody else, to bring myself along through this discovery process that ultimately led to some things that I had no particular interest in studying or had no clue were connected. And one of them is the relationship between the acoustics of Rosslyn Chapel or any cathedral or ancient temple or things like that. And there's a whole field called psychoacoustics or archaeoacoustics that is developing right now in various universities. A lot of studies that have been done through the 90s in particular in studying the acoustics of different temples. And then connecting that, as I came to find out, with the architectural design of the space. Why are these different temples and cathedrals and so forth developed according to certain architectures? Well, that's where the acoustics come in. But then there's sacred geometries involved. Well, there's a connection between these geometrical, these harmonic geometries, as I call them, and the harmonic acoustics that are contained within them. So they're not separate disciplines, they're really one.
I just love this study, and I guess give the listeners an example of how does this play out in Rosslyn Chapel with, I guess, something called the double square geometry.
Yeah. So there's really a variety of sacred geometries that encompass and define the outer and internal geometries and architectures of Rosslyn Chapel. And that's really part of its collegiate teaching value, I think, that Sinclair and Hay put into it. You can, for instance, overlay the Vitruvian Man, the circle and square, the squaring of the circle, as they call it, and the human body proportions that Da Vinci, made very popular, but that was actually originally developed by a Roman architect named Vitruvius in 100 AD. And he, that geometry overlays with other types of sacred geometry. There's just a whole layer after layer of different harmonic geometries that can be found in Rosslyn Chapel. And at the center of all of those geometries is this, as you mentioned, the double square. Well, all a double square means is that, you have a square and then you just duplicate that square and tack it onto one of the edges so that you have a rectangle that is in the dimensions of, 1 by 2. And it turns out that if you go back, you find this double square repeated in other ancient temples that, you find them, first of all, you find them in a lot of cathedrals throughout Europe in different multiples. But, you find them in ancient temples as well. And you go back, you'll find that the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid is a double square. And so it goes far back, and you say, well, why? What's the special properties of this double square? What you find is that the diagonal of the double square is the square root is in the proportion of the square root of 5 to the lengths of the sides of the rectangle.
Mm-hmm.
And the square root of 5 is where the golden ratio is determined. 1 plus square root of 5 divided by 2 is this golden ratio, which is a constant of nature.
Mm-hmm.
It's found everywhere through nature. And by the way, as an aside, it's often avoided as much as possible by science. Yeah. I mean, it still emerges, and it's admitted to be, a major constant, but, science has not done a good job of integrating that into their curriculum or the worldview, because it may be found at all scales, but it's not used to integrate the different scientific disciplines, even though it could be. So an interesting, result or downstream effect of this avoidance strategy that began several hundred years ago. Well, so anyway, back to Rosalind. The reason the square root of 5 as a diagonal is so important is because like the golden ratio, acoustically, it is a dampening proportion. Waves cannot propagate when they are close to a golden section, in terms of, if you had one wave resonating at one frequency and then you tried to introduce a frequency that's at a golden ratio to that first frequency, it'll kill the wave.
Interesting. So is this somehow connected to the underlying usage of the pentagram?
Yes, exactly. So the pentagram, okay, every intersection, when you create a little pentagram, that's one of the first things you learn when you're a kid is, how to draw a pentagram by connecting the 5 dots. It turns out that every intersection of a pentagram is a golden ratio. And the square root of 5 is found. I mean, that's why the golden ratio is related to the square root of 5, is that it's through this pentagram geometry. And of course, the Roman Church, as everybody knows, and you see it in pop culture everywhere, is that this pentagram is a symbol for witchcraft.
Right. And if this is the dampener, and this is what the Catholic Church wanted to get rid of,
yes,
that's why the pentagram is bad.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so, in pop culture you see, and I guess in many Wiccan ceremonies as well, you'd stand inside the pentagram and it would protect you from the evil spirits. It would allow you to control them. Well, one of Solomon's keys, his lesser key, was a pentagram. And, all of his pentacles, as he called them, were ways of controlling these elemental spirits. Calling them up and then trapping them inside this pentagram and controlling them, Well, isn't it interesting if you just want to think about, okay, why is it we have these pentagrams on our flags, and why does Macy's have a pentagram? Why is there the Pentagon as the shape of the building for military strategy and headquarters or whatever, and in the U.S., and you could keep going down the list. And if you go back in history, you find the pentagram was associated with the human body and health in the human body. It was associated with the 5 wounds of Jesus and all kinds of connections to the pentagram.
Yeah.
And in fact, you can go back there are Sumerian artifacts of pentagrams that are identified with the goddess of Venus. Well, interestingly, Venus traces out a pentacle. It's a rose sort of thing, rose shape, and that's essentially nested pentagrams in the sky, and it's its resonance pattern with Earth.
And that is something you've said before. And this, to get back to the Rosalind Chapel, you say it creates like a rose pattern, and this is where they get the name, I guess, right?
Yes.
Yeah, the rose line.
That's right, Rosalind. And also Rosabelle, and a variety of different names related to this rose concept. And in fact, you have the Tudor rose, the royal lineages in England and so forth. There's all these connections back now to then the various goddesses associated with Venus. And there's a long line of goddesses associated with Venus. and it gets into various other symbolisms, such as the phoenix and there's just a whole host of symbolisms that connect it with resurrection and rebirth. And that's because the evening star, Venus, the morning star, was considered the mother, and it resurrected the sun in the morning because it would rise above the horizon before the sun as the torch, and that's where we get the Liberty torch. And in the evening star, which was also Venus, would take the sun down into the underworld. When the sun goes down under the world, it's in the underworld.
Yep.
And it would bring life. It was a way of bestowing life to the sun in the underworld, to keep it alive.
Yeah.
And so this idea of the pentagram and the rose connected with Venus and the goddesses, the various goddesses of Venus, are at the foundation of religion. And it turns out at the foundation of how harmonics form.
Mm-hmm.
And the double square, So I'm drawing a variety of different things together through this number 5, the square root of 5, the golden ratio being in the pentagram, the symbolism of the pentagram, the resonance of an actual planet, to Earth.
Yeah, it's a lot of tie-ins.
Yeah, and so there's this huge historic connection, but there's a physics connection too. And it has to do with the role of the square root of 5 and the golden ratio as a damping container. And that's really a key term, damping container. And I'll illustrate that in something that a lot of people have experienced and probably don't even realize it. The whole tradition of creating speaker enclosures, for stereos,
Mm-hmm.
for music, follows the proportions of golden ratio. It might be the golden ratio is 1.618033, and it goes on. It's an infinite, non-repeating number. But you can get close to it and still have the same deadening effect. And so, for instance, 1.62 would still create a deadening effect, what you'd call anechoic, a non-echoing proportion, where you don't get feedback or reverberation. Well, these the art of creating speaker enclosures usually has often, traditionally used proportions of 1 by 0.62 by 1.62.
Okay.
In terms of, length, width, and depth. And the reason that they would use those proportions as opposed to any other proportion is because standing waves, harmonics and resonances won't form inside that. It will kill them.
Okay.
And so you get a very pure sound when you use a speaker enclosure that is built according to the golden ratio. Same thing for auditoriums, but most auditoriums aren't built that way anymore. Ancient ones were. And cathedrals and so forth would use this double square as an approximation or as a reasonable approximation for an ideal anechoic chamber.
Okay. So just to connect a few things for people who are listening, your second book is called The Venus Blueprint because you discovered that Rosslyn Chapel has coded in it the pattern of Venus, this rose line, the Rosslyn Chapel.
Yes.
And then through this expression of this pattern, they actually get geometry that creates acoustics in the room that make it easier to talk and has less echo. And
yeah.
I think that's so fascinating that this can all be extrapolated from mapping the path of Venus in the sky.
Yeah, it's stunning. It's stunning to me. It was stunning that I hadn't really read that anywhere,
Right.
Because it seemed so obvious and so completely integrated. And by the way, there's a pillar at the center of what's called the Holy of Holies of Rosslyn Chapel. And at the top of it are musical angels playing instruments. And guess what they're sitting on? They're sitting on pentagrams
Huh.
that are carved into the stone. So the music is literally resonating on the foundation of this deadening feature of the pentagram.
It puts the pentagram in a whole new light. It really gives a lot of clarity to that, man. Yeah,
it does. And the interesting thing is that since there is this sort of pentagram as part of these layerings of sacred geometry, that you'll find integrated into the design of Rosalind, that within that pentagram is this double square with the square root of 5. And that is the dimensions of the interior of the chapel, and it creates a wonderful... The other thing that's interesting is that they explicitly then create what's called the choir area of the chapel, which is like a higher, or has a higher ceiling, under over where the majority of the congregation would sit, and that higher choir area is exactly, it's as exact as you can get without it being an infinite number, is the golden ratio to the length of the chapel. So you've got a double square that creates this horizontal clean resonance, but then you've got this golden ratio choir to the ceiling height.
Damn.
And the effect is just stunning when you're actually in there. And I didn't know what to expect when I went there a second time, and I participated in a seminar at the Rosalind Hotel, which is just down the road, and then spoke also again in the chapel itself. And then they did a concert of the Rosalind Motet and some other music, and I purposefully went to the back of the chapel in the center and stood there while the music played, in order to try to see what kind of acoustical effect it would have.
Mm-hmm.
And the effect was, it sounded like the musicians were, first of all, directly in front of the congregation. It's kind of not the Holy of Holies area, but the area that is at the end of the far end of the choir. It's sort of a secondary altar where they do most of the, if not all of the actual services that they still hold there. And that's where the musicians were set up. And I'm standing there facing them. And when they're playing, their music doesn't sound like it's coming from them at all. In fact, it's as if they're motioning, and the music is coming from above. It's resonating up inside this choir area that's at a golden ratio, to the double square,
Mm-hmm.
and it's raining down on you. So it sounds like the music is coming down from heaven. That's the effect that this thing was designed to create. And the way it does it is that the music disperses and is deadened down in this double square area, but it resonates up inside the choir area, which has a different dimension that actually resonates more than the lower part. And so since it's resonating so much up there, it still disperses downward, and it overwhelms the deader area down below. And so it sounds like the music is being sucked up into this choir area and then pushed back down as if it were coming from the sky.
Man, that is a bit trippy. And this is super fascinating, speaking of trippy, because this is where it gets into, because this is really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the study of, using resonance and vibration to alter consciousness. We're talking about a chapel that has an area called the altar, and you've actually you've uncovered a whole lot of stuff. I bet you didn't expect this to dovetail into psychedelics, but it seems like that's an integral part of this stuff as well in the past, right?
It is, because here's what happened. I got to this point that I've described of, understanding the geometry and the acoustics and the symbolisms of the chapel. And then just as I had done up to that point, I asked the next question, which was, why are they doing this?
Yeah.
Okay. And it's like, most people would probably stop and say, well, they like the acoustical symbolism of music coming down from heaven. They like the idea of the harmonic geometry and all integrated in with music, because part of what I hadn't explained is that there's actually a sort of a musical scale aspect to the layout of that double square. It's like an octave, like a 12-step octave, and So there's symbolisms and the placement of the pillars along those ways, and all. It's just absolutely stunning. And the spires on the outside, and there's just other symbolisms. But I asked the question, okay, so they're clearly, trying to sort of, in a metaphysical way, in a way that most people would never be aware, using music and acoustics and frequency and things like that to create a more, I guess, to aid in prayer and meditation, to make it a meditative environment, a sacred space. And I just asked, why are they doing that? And so by asking that question and integrating that with some other sort of key terms, that I began to pull up some scientific papers, through Google, that had discovered that there were certain frequencies that would be used in ancient incubation chambers, which would be underground facilities, that, are thousands of years old. And the ancient practice of philosophers and even churches, Roman churches, they would try to simulate these caves and underground chambers where things would resonate well. So somebody could chant, it would resonate throughout the structure, and they would use entheogens. They would use some sort of teacher plants or fungus, mushrooms and things like that to aid in, the meditation. Right. Or to open up the heavens or whatever, to alter state of reality. And so I began to realize, well, my God, then there's a connection between, the core ritual of communion taking and all of these other mind-altering devices, of acoustics and symbolisms and geometries and so forth, that they're all part of what I would think of as ancient scientific technology for the exploration of non-physical realms.
Yes, man. This is the biggest thing that I've gotten out of your work. And of course, we hear these whispers and rumors that the psychedelics used to be a part of this, but I feel like there's a clarity that comes out of the narrative you've just weaved that I didn't have before. And if you look at, it's obviously popular now, these excursions to Peru, to the Amazon to take ayahuasca with the shamans. If you look at what they're doing, I mean, they involve chanting, rhythmic drumming, taking a liquid psychedelic substance, an entheogen, from a cup. Yes. If you look at the remnants of a mass, I mean, go back in time and what that originally was. It's a lot closer to the shamanic journey in Peru than it is the manifestation we have today.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And, the only reason that those kind of practices still exist is because they were the most isolated. Yes. From, being interrupted. Whereas over in the Middle East and Europe and so forth, they were suppressed and, outlawed. I mean, entheogenic communion was outlawed by the Roman Church it's either the 5th or 6th century. It's soon after the rise of the sort of Holy Roman Empire, the beginnings of it, and for good reason, because in Rome at the time there were Mithraeans all over Rome, and there was still Sibyl worship up on one of the 7 hills, and the Vatican itself was a place where Etruscan oracles, which were probably, which, by the way, were worshipers of Shiva, okay, on Vatican Hill. And they grew on Vatican Hill, they grew they made a bitter wine, which they called Vitica, to their god, which was named Vitica also. And they would drink that, and people would come to them to ask questions, to, see the future and so forth. That's the true origin of the Vatican. That's why it's called the Holy See,
Yeah. I love how this dovetails in with magic also. The idea of entity communication, of exploring the spirit realms. I mean, if we go back to Egypt, a lot of the kind of vague idea we have of what Egypt was about at the time seems to be about exploring consciousness, preparing for death, which is, getting familiar with the non-physical realms and communicating with something non-human. And you bring it right up through modern times. I mean, I feel like it's never been clearer what the origin was, how it was lost, and the underlying value of this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the Greeks, too, they learned from the Egyptians. The Lycaonian mysteries were all about taking the kykeon, Holy Communion, and during initiation and certain, the lesser mysteries, the greater mysteries, it was all part of, all integrated in with the communion ceremony. And so part of the Venus Blueprint was also trying to go back and figure out, well, now where did the communion ritual begin? Mm-hmm. And when you go back, you realize that, well, the Zoroastrians were doing it, before the Greeks and before all of that. If you trace it back far enough, you get into the Rig Veda, and you find that the core and the central premise of the Rig Veda is this elixir of immortality called soma, that was the drink of the gods. And then you study that further and you find out that, well, there's at the center, or the highest ceremony of the Vedics is this Vyapeya ceremony that involves winning the soma. and you know what they would do? They created this thing called a yupa pole. It was a pole that would be stuck in the ground, and at the top was sort of a cross. And a circle. It was called the sun door. And they would, in this Vyapeya ceremony, they would take a ladder and they'd lean it against the yupa pole, and they would, the man and wife usually, the man would start to walk up the pole after doing a whole bunch of other things, including, sacrificing the soma ingredients, which is a combination of things, that one of the things being most likely, at least originally, according to a number of botanists, people like Gordon Wasson and Rucker and some others, that soma had as one of its ingredients had amanita mushrooms.
Boom.
Which are psychoactive.
Yeah.
And yet in other communions in different places, you find with the Zoroastrian tradition that it likely had basically an amphetamine, ephedra kind of ingredient that would add more of a speed element to it. But, I think as you move, especially down in the Mediterranean, you'd probably have more acacia extracts, that have DMT in it, and right. Which is highly psychoactive. And so I think as it migrates in different places, it would have it might have other ingredients or a blend of ingredients, and then eventually those get lost and it just becomes sort of empty ritual type drinks. But when you go back to that original Vyapeya ceremony, this guy would say, ascend we to heaven, and the wife, holding hands, would say, ascend we, and he would go up, he would say certain words and things and climb up the ladder, and at the top of the yupa pole, where the sun door, the little circular, what was called a wheaten wheel, and across, literally an X across holding this wheel at the top of the yupa pole would be the soma. It'd be in a form of like a dough or something. Mm-hmm. And he would then get that and he would eat it, and he would get it and rub it on his belly because that's where the soma rested and that kind of thing. And then, interestingly enough, the sun door would open and they would see into heaven behind the sun.
Man.
They would see through the sun into heaven. And this was called the Ascension. This was the Ascension ceremony. Well, the yupa pole became the Christian cross. Mm-hmm. And the idea of climbing that pole and sacrificing the soma by both burning it in a fire, which delivers it to the gods, and then climbing the pole and eating it, is that you are ascending to heaven. You're seeing the path, the way to God.
Right.
And so this was what the symbolism of the cross is. I mean, they crucified the Christians, on the Romans crucified them on their cross because the cross meant something. It wasn't just a place to nail people or hang them,
Mm-hmm.
It was a symbol of ascending to heaven.
Yeah, man.
That had descended into Judaism and early Christianity from much older Vedic origins.
There are so many little threads and sagas here that kind of put a new twist on a symbol that we've taken for granted, and we kind of learn where it came from in this context. And the psychedelic thing is just really amazing to me because I've had a couple psychedelic experiences, DMT experiences, and the two things that I experience that I hear from most people are geometric shapes and entities. So we're talking about how the geometry ties in here,
yes.
And we're talking about how religion can be based off of this communion with spirits.
Yes, exactly.
Boom.
Exactly.
It's a wild time to be alive. Really fascinating stuff. But man, I guess that brings us to the end of the line. Amazing work. I've really, really enjoyed this. I mean, it details so much of so many interesting subjects. It's just great. I'm so happy that we've been able to make this happen. Thanks to Gene who got us connected.
Yeah.
This is one of my favorites in a while, man. Nothing has really challenged me the way this has. It's very dense, but I feel like I'm catching on to some of it. But I guess before we really go, could you remind the people about your books and website and where they can dig deeper into this stuff?
Sure. My website is interferencetheory.com, and through that you can pretty much, you can certainly get to a lot of material that's not just about the books, but that is background material. There's some interactive flash simulations there related to it. There's other things, and also on Facebook you can just look up the Venus Blueprint as a page, or also interferencetheory.com page. And if you like those, then I do post new things that I come across there. And there's a huge archive you can explore through the photo albums. But you can pick up, there is an electronic book version, PDF, so you can read it on anything, that's downloadable from the website for Interference. And I did sell, I was self-publishing the paper book at one time, but it's currently out of print. I keep getting requests. I just need to decide whether I want to take that on again or not. Mm-hmm. But anyway, you can get the electronic book there, and then you can
for free, right?
Yeah, for free. And then you can buy the Venus Blueprint through Amazon or Barnes and Noble or any number of websites. It's distributed by Random House, so it's pretty much available everywhere. And the new book hopefully will be coming out sometime next year. It's called the Vajra Sequence. At least that's the current name. You never know what the publisher might do with that. Right. But it takes all of these ideas that we've been talking about and paints them into a slightly future, not too far in the future, but slightly futuristic scenario where there's just this sudden sort of paradigm shift, sort of like when the internet hit or when mobile communications hit. Some sort of a sudden jolt that a set of discoveries that occurs and how it interfaces with the financial systems and the political systems and the wars. So it's very integrated with current events. So it'll be fun when it's out.
Yeah, as a conspiracy guy, the situation with the history of finance and banking is of huge interest to me, and that's one area that I didn't ask you about. But of course, it seems like fractional reserve banking and the idea of turning current debt into currency comes from ancient priesthoods that were very involved in banking. And who knows? That's another component.
Well, money is a form of stored energy,
Yeah, boom.
Yeah, in some form, Well, I've really enjoyed doing this, and look forward to seeing it out there, and hopefully other people will enjoy listening to it, and it'll create some more controversy and more conversations.
Yeah, man. Well, thanks again. It has been a real blast. Hopefully we can do it again sometime, maybe when that novel comes out. But
yeah.
Until then, just keep at it, man. Take care.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Greg.
Whoop, there it is, people. What a great show that was, at least to me. I mean, the connections between Venus and the pentagram, entheogens, and ancient religion, the idea that there was once a global culture participating in deep psychedelic rituals that was stomped out as far as it could be, but these pockets in the Amazon, these shamanic traditions, the ayahuasca pilgrimages that are such a fad right now, they might be what's left of what was once a widespread culture of consciousness expansion. I do think it's having those regular experiences with entheogens that reminds us that we are more than our bodies, that there is more to life than 3D reality, that there are actually other beings you can commune with when you turn your dial beyond the morning commute in the soul-crushing cubicle. And when astral travel and psychedelics are such a big part of everyday life, nobody's going to care what the Catholic Church says you need to do. Nobody's going to spend 4 decades answering phones for customer service when they realize that life's just a game. So a fundamental aspect of total control, of elbowing your way to a place of authority, of ensuring humanity never awakens from their amnesia, is removing those traditions entirely from the culture. I just told a story a few weeks back in the wrap-up about my Don Peyote acid trip and my lengthy stream of telepathic back and forth with a nearby star. Imagine a society that takes these substances every night, stacks them with ritual drumming and chanting and perfectly tuned architecture that takes you much, much deeper. Then you go out into the night sky with no light pollution and you look up. It's not hard for me to believe that the path of every illuminated dot could tell a story, and that one can reflect long and deep enough in the right state of mind and find well-defined personality traits in the stars. With all the distractions and happenings of modern day life, I pretty much did it myself, so this all really makes sense to me and works to explain a lot of the confusion in my mind about what the past might have been like. Another big takeaway for me, well, of course, things are layered and manipulated, and it's hard to get a handle on a symbol's original meaning. But I think when you can find something like this, a pentagram in the sky, the path of Venus specifically, that seems to be a safe bet on where it originally came from. And to hear that this symbol has a natural damping effect vibrationally, energetically, acoustically, well, I think this is the science of why it's used in magic rituals to control spirits. And why it's used in government buildings like the Pentagon and government symbols like the flag and the dollar bill and all these things. I mean, we have 50 pentagrams on the U.S. flag, one for each good little state that obeys the federal overlords, and by extension, probably the British Crown. But it's a symbol of control, not freedom. But in the second half of the show, the plus show, the space we laid in the areas of entheogenics and magic, we fleshed that out a little bit. We also talk about how mythology formed in this new entheogenic context of ancient ritual, how some of the great mathematicians and developers of geometric principles were probably trying to express the visuals from their trips, like Francis Crick and the DNA strand. Those geometric patterns, the reality code, and the insight into these building blocks of the universe, clearly that information was valuable and was thought about differently at a time in the past. Richard also talks about how the Hebrews reserved entheogenics for the priest class even before Christianity, and how this connects to the removal of the sacred feminine and its tie-ins to Yom Kippur. I also asked Richard if all this can be extrapolated from the orbital pattern of Venus, what can be extracted from the orbital patterns of other celestial bodies. We talked the possibilities of hollow planets and Richard's research that shows space is not just an empty void like we've been told. And of course, how everything is backwards, and science's sole focus on the external, and by extension perhaps NASA's role in fueling outward exploration and completely overshadowing inward exploration, well, those could be modern extensions of the same manipulation. It's a great show, both hours 1 and 2. I would greatly appreciate if you enjoy the first hour of this and all the THC shows we do here, that you'd hop over to the HighersideChatsPlus.com and sign up for the $5 a month to support the show and keep me doing it full time. That is only if you find it different and unique enough in the vast electronic sea of limitless options to contribute to it and to hear twice as much in return. Also, I am leaving for Armenia this Friday on the Graham Hancock Tour, looking at ancient sites that are the subject for his new book, the sequel to Fingerprints of the Gods. It will be my first major international trip. I'm pretty nervous and excited and all that great stuff, and I plan to capture as much footage and audio as I can and put something special together for those Plus members that made it possible. So why not get a head start and start digging through the archives of all the second hours you've missed so far? I do have 2 shows in the can. They jive very much with this one, and I think you're really going to love them. And when I get back, I have no idea what state I'm going to be in, but I'm really going to have to hustle in the last half of August to get 3 more shows out. But I can't complain when I have literally the best job I could ever ask for. And thanks to everybody who listens and makes that possible. But that said, I'm getting out of here. I hope you're living all your dreams. Keep your head up, your pimp hand strong, your tail feathers shaking, and your mind expanding. I'm Greg Carlwood, and I've done my part. Your move, whitewashers of the higher history and consciousness controllers of modern man. Your frickin' move.
No one knows what it's like to be the bad man, to be the sad man behind blue eyes. And no one knows what it's like to be hated, to be faded, to telling only lies. But my dreams aren't as empty as my conscience seems to be. I have hours only lonely since they exposed me on THC. No one knows what it's like to feel these feelings like I do, and I blame you. No one bites back as hard on their anger. None of my pain and woe can show through. But my dreams aren't as empty as my conscience seems to be. I have hours always lonely since they exposed me on THC. But my dreams aren't as empty as my conscience seems to be. I have hours always lonely since they exposed me on THC. No one knows what it's like to be the bad man, to be the sad man behind